Why do governments keep failing people with mental illness? Why do grand plans for mental health reform make some politicians popular, some reformers rich, but leave the mad to dance alone in the streets? The world is in a crisis it has not seen for 100 years. Old assumptions about who rules the world and how they rule are changing, and calm reflections on history informed by real experience governing can help us through this crisis. On the Burning Archive today, I am looking at government failure in mental health. Despite apparent good intentions from all sorts of reformers and visionaries, our institutions of mental health care disappoint so many of us, and the real experience of mental illness is often tragic. Why do governments keep getting mental illness wrong? That is the question on today's Burning Archive.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.
I'm Jeff Rich. I'm an independent author, podcaster, and now retired, very, very minor government official. And I do the Burning Archive podcast, which is about history, culture, geopolitics, from the unique perspective of a retired government official and historian who is curious about all the world's cultural traditions of responsible statecraft and many other aspects of history, culture, and human experience. Nothing human is alien to me, I think Voltaire said, and my unusual combination of experiences and interests reveals unpredictable connections. Sharing those connections is what I try to do on the podcast, and I hope it reveals some interesting insights for you. And nowhere else perhaps is that unusual combination of experiences more apparent than in this show on mental illness, which I have had a long personal, career, cultural, creative and intellectual engagement with. Much of my 30-odd years as a very, very minor government official touched in one way or another on mental illness. And you may ask, what has mental illness got to do with the multipolar world and the world crisis at the biggest world crisis in 100 years? Or who am I to say that governments have failed in their plans for mental health reform, especially given the much touted Victorian Royal Commission on mental health that reported a couple of years ago? What do these issues of madness have to do with democracy, and how can the Burning Archive illuminate this sensitive area of public policy and personal difficulty? Can I make it cohere? Let us try taking each of those questions in turn. Now, mental illness and mental health care are not generally seen as central to stories of the multipolar world. All podcasts about geopolitics and other big issues in history, such as this one. Diplomacy, yes. Depression, no. Armies, yes. Anxiety, no. And there are not many podcasts, I think, that really kind of make the link that I do between mental illness as being central, in fact, to this greatest crisis in the last 100 years and the sort of big issues of the multipolar world. Even in general discussion of history and politics, mental illness tends to be closeted away as a special topic, which I think probably means that governments rather get let off the hook because people are a little bit too sensitive to criticism of how they are performing any effort to improve things is okay, right? But I do see this issue as connected to the big issues of the multipolar world and some of the big themes of change in this world crisis that I have discussed in this podcast over the last 100 episodes, no less. My last episode 100, gave a bit of a review of how I talked about all those different themes and how the podcast tries to make sense of this history-changing time that we're living through. Clearly, mental illness, there are different experiences in different places, so the multipolar world model makes sense. The evolution of mental health culture, institutions, treatments and policies in Australia is different to America, different to China, different to India or the Soviet Union and Russia, countries like Mexico. And many of the histories and policy prescriptions tend to conflate the experience of Western Europe and North America with civilization, as was discussed in episode 98, Madness in Western Civilization Today, that looked at various histories of mental illness and mental health care, including the one by Michel Foucault, the very famous Madness in Civilization by Michel Foucault. So the theme of imperial rivalry or civilizational clashes of civilization in concepts of madness, as much as anything, does seem to make sense here. I also argued in that podcast 98 that Michel Foucault's ideas and the experience of people with mental illness in many countries up to the 1960s was one of the key original sources, I guess, of what we now know as identity politics or sort of radical politics around what previously was seen as kind of personal, experiential sort of issues. The anti-psychiatry movement, 60s cultural radicalism, the adage that the personal is political, and the assertion of a larger range of human rights as experienced by more and more particularly identified people has really been closely linked to ideas and the politics and the experiences of mental illness. And they have transformed political discussion around the world, migrating into many different domains. The political system is still adapting to this disorder. And thirdly, mental illness and its treatment from the 1960s is one of several profound transformations in the real social conditions all around the world. Big changes which we are, in a way, still coming to terms with, still trying to understand, still seeing the effects of, and still developing responses to. Population aging, people living to 80 plus rather than, dying of a heart attack in your 60s, much greater levels of education, abundance, working lives of symbolic manipulation of texts and numbers rather than hard yakka, digging things out of the ground, and digital second lives, travel, communications, but also real experiences of illness and mental illness. The way we experience illness, one of those fundamental human experiences, has changed a hell of a lot over the last 60 years. In mental illness, apart from anything else, the availability of psychotropic medications, lithium, the SSRIs, the main treatments for schizophrenia and stuff like that, have fundamentally changed the experience of both mental illness and its treatment. And moreover, some people like Ian McGilchrist argue that within the culture and its interaction with the biology, there is a general bias, I guess, in, let's call it Western society, towards left hemisphere brain dominance that is also changing our experience of things. So mental illness is fundamental to the kind of experience of fragmenting societies that are reconfiguring around new kaleidoscopes that I've often talked about on the podcast. And then fourthly, mental illness connects to the theme of cultural decay or change, if you prefer. how we think, imagine, symbolise and experience madness or mental illness has changed a lot in the last 60 years since Michel Foucault published A History of Madness, in many ways, in many positive ways, and across the spectrum, both our perceptions of people in crisis, but also the perceptions of their ordinary lives. The culture of madness defines as its opposite or as a point in its spectrum our ideas of order and civilization. This is the deep truth that is still there in Foucault's History of Madness despite all the criticism. So there's been huge changes in our cultural ideas of madness, our acceptance of it, our sense of its how ubiquitous it is, and how whether it should be displayed and understood by everyone or hidden away. All those four themes of the podcast are touched upon by mental illness, and all those four aspects of the evolving world crisis are touched upon by mental illness. It's actually at the heart of this storm. And what's more, the experience of mental illness and the recurrent failure of governments to reform mental health reform is also linked to the theme of democracy and its discontents that has featured in the podcast, especially over the last, 10 or 20 episodes. Isn't the test of a good society how it treats its most vulnerable? And so should not government's performance on mental health be a key test of the functioning of democracy, of the political institutions and cultures in which we live, whether they are democracies or not? And in my view, governments, democratic governments, keep failing people with mental illness. Shouldn't we be curious about why? Not only if we are mental health specialists, but if we are ordinary citizens, ordinary lowly government officials, ordinary people who sometimes experience troubles with their mind. Now, of course, there are shades of grey, and of course some good is done. Notably, I would say in Australia, for example, the widespread availability of psychological services through the Medicare system is one of those major improvements in people's actual lives that some of the reformers still don't quite like. So, of course, there are shades of grey in this, but I think a big, bold statement that governments are failing is justified by the overall record, and I speak of that record as, if you like, an eyewitness of failure in governments, in healthcare settings, on the streets, in people's lives. Because, after all, I spent 30 odd years working adjacent to these issues. And what's more, what's interesting about this issue and its connection with the big crisis of the world is it's not like it's only in mental health where governments fail. It's a well-established argument that part of the democratic crisis is that people are not getting what they want from democracy. They're not getting it in mental health. They're not getting it in other areas too. This is the argument of Francis Fukuyama in Political Order and Political Decay, a truly magnificent piece of work, perhaps the best book Francis Fukuyama has ever written. He argues governments have lost their authority because they have failed to deliver the services and infrastructure people want. There's no magic about trust and charisma. This issue has even been demonstrated quantitatively with various studies that look at the huge gap between the policy preferences of most people, of voters, of the majority of the population, and the actual policy decisions of governments. There is actually very little correlation between them. However, there is a very strong correlation between the policy preferences of business elites and technocrats, let's say, and government policy decisions. And it's also said by Stein Ringen, a Norwegian political sociologist who's written widely on democracy, including a book from, I think, 2021 called How Democracies Live, that the simplest explanation for why people don't trust governments or democracy is because governments and democracy have not earned their trust. And so mental health, I think, is in particular an example of this. It's an example where too often governments have made grandiose announcements of their commitment to reform, of their commitment to help people with mental illness, and then the caravan moves on and no one ever gets around to actually testing how well things change on the ground. And I think this has perhaps grown over the last 30 years or so as community concern with mental health has grown. The value of using mental health as a political symbol, as part of the political spectacle, has grown. But there has not been a corresponding growth in the attention to the real practical concern, the real compassionate support for people through methods of care, institutions, and compassion for people with mental illness. They have been made into a bit of a political symbol of justice, and as a result we see over and over inquiries saying that there have been catastrophic failures in mental health.
A special sitting of Parliament at Melbourne's Royal Exhibition Building to tackle a problem both sides of politics have failed to solve.
That shame should be shouldered by a generation of policymakers.
As a Member of Parliament, I stand here embarrassed that so many of you have been let down so badly.
The 2-year Mental Health Royal Commission revealed the system is chronically underfunded and often can't reach the people who need it.
It's all well and good to tell someone to ask for help, but what happens when you ask and there is no answer?
Under-resourcing has led to an over-reliance on medication, and too little is offered by way of therapeutic and recovery-oriented services.
In the second segment of the podcast, I like to connect the big issue in world affairs that I'm talking about to some real events in history. And as it happened, I worked as a government official for 33 years, including on quite a few issues directly connected with mental health, and witnessed many of the characters and individuals and institutions and services and interest groups and players and government reports and archival documents and secret cabinet submissions and all the rest on these issues to do with mental health over that period of time. And what is more, for a while I was working on the Victorian government response to the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, looking at health institutions. And as part of that work, I had to investigate the history of the health department, including its mental health components and all of its institutions in relationship to child sexual abuse, and more broadly, I guess, care for children. As a result, I developed a fairly good understanding of both the public and the archival history of our department and the mental health services. So in a way, what I want to share, I guess, is some of my own both anecdotal experiences of around this sort of government failure, because you might be asking, who am I to say governments have failed on mental health? Now, obviously in 10 minutes I can't share all of that, nor can I share anything that is, secret and confidential without element of discreet cloaking. And, I've only got 10 minutes or so to do it. So this podcast is only perhaps an initial attempt to make sense of what I have learned around all of that. I'll probably include an essay or two on this topic in my book 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat that I'm hoping to release in late June. But let me just share a few little glimpses of what I've seen of a track record of failure of governments on mental health. Not so much, I guess, against their own terms so much as letting people with mental illness, their families, their carers, and all of those who are concerned about them down. I mean, way back in the 1880s, there was, in fact, the very first Royal Commission into mental health in Victoria, despite what the Victorian government has said. The recent Royal Commission into mental health is not the first Royal Commission into mental health. There was a major Royal Commission in the 1880s that actually recommended a whole bunch of significant changes to improve institutions and care and people's experience. But it ran aground a catastrophic economic depression in the 1890s, which led really to 50 years or so of pretty hard times for Victoria, where its mental health institutions became shockingly under-resourced, shockingly poorly conditioned. But in my more direct experience, I remember seeing some of the responses of senior Victorian government bureaucrats to the early 1990s Scruton Human Rights Commission inquiry into the rights and experiences of people with mental illness. There was a level of dismissal, I guess, of groundbreaking report as cloudy vision of lawyers and human rights advocates, and they attempted, to their credit, instead to form a managerial social justice-y counter to that. I saw the closure of many of the big institutions, the big psychiatric hospitals, the big intellectual disability institutions, where some of the unions had very large employment and were perhaps more concerned around protecting their members rather than looking after the interests of the people with mental health issues. And governments were perhaps more focused on paying off debt through selling these institutions rather than closing the institutions in order to build new services to actually help people with mental illness. Well, so many of the big institutions which had been emptied out with the new medications and new treatments through the 60s and 70s and 80s really were closed down in the 90s, but not with a fundamental transformation in the care for people with mental illness. I saw alcohol and drug policies, the Pennington inquiry in the 1990s, the early formation of Beyond Blue. I saw in the mid-2000s the yoking of mental health to what was described as the human capital agenda, to try to make it attractive to economists and treasury officials in the vain hope that somehow that would unlock the pockets of the treasury officials and they would get more money into mental health. But in a way it tried to turn the complexities of the experience of mental illness into a question about productivity and workforce participation to the benefit of many overpaid consultants and not so much to the benefit of people with mental illness. I saw the whole era of the construction of Headspace and Patrick McGorry's brave reforms for youth mental health, but also them running aground around bureaucratic and institutional and disciplinary tensions that meant they perhaps did not realise their original vision. I saw a well-meaning but overly complicated policy from the sort of 2000s mental health matters run aground in a whole lot of bureaucratic nonsense. I saw 2 mental health acts go through their rather complicated processes of development and change and wrestle with the extraordinarily complex legal and human rights issues to do with compulsory treatment. I personally developed a couple of major government strategies on alcohol and drugs and was so frustrated with the persistent failure of so many in government but also in the community to accept and in the mental health sector to genuinely see addiction and the issues around addiction as part of mental health policy. I saw welfare reforms that were conveniently obsessed with, people on disability payments getting a job as the solution to their mental health, rather than what was really going on in their minds. I saw convenient arguments that housing will solve the problems of mental illness, and those arguments being advanced by housing bureaucrats and housing NGOs. I saw a government in 2015 or 2014 promise to develop a 10-year mental health plan, tick it off its list, but deliver nothing in it. And I saw a government produce a suicide prevention policy with the grandiose target to reduce the suicide rate by 50% over some unspecified period, maybe 5 years. But sadly, the suicide rate has not budged since. I saw governments attempt to introduce coercive approaches to people with complex needs related to mental illness and violence, even though all the best advice was that those coercive approaches would not work. And I saw a constant failure to respond to the well-documented need to increase resources into mental health services, a constant preference to pass the buck to another level of government and to insist that somehow the fact that we had a lower per capita expenditure on mental health than any other state was actually a good thing and a sign of our bureaucrats' exceptional quality and competence, rather than tight-fisted, mean Treasury decisions and ministerial decisions. And I saw numerous inquiries from productivity commissions and others, expert reports, all the rest of it, obsessing about system changes and not really delivering real practical improvements in care. But the worst failure, I think, was the Victorian Royal Commission on Mental Health, chaired by Penny Armitage, a former, social worker, former head of Children's Protection Society, child protection bureaucrat, then senior bureaucrat in the justice system and the Department of Human Services, the head of the Justice Department, in fact. And that Royal Commission, there has been enormous media around, and it might be an unpopular opinion in some quarters to say this, but I do feel it was a failure. No inquiry should be treated as a sacred cow. So let me just briefly sketch why I say that. For discussion and, of course, debate, it could be that I'm wrong. It was promised cynically in 2014 by the very same government that had delivered a wet squib of a 10-year mental health plan and wanted to be seen to have another talismanic social issue that it had solved and it had eliminated in 2014. It was the Royal Commission, that is, it was stacked politically with favourites and people associated with the governing party, with key ministers and a number of commissioners who frankly had passed their prime. Its public hearings were indulgences of bureaucrats with tiresome talk about systems reform, rehashing many old complaints about the mental health system. It simply did not justify the incredibly expensive and coercive investigatory powers of a Royal Commission. It was like the world's most expensive management consultancy. Its first report undermined its credibility by proposing, of all things, a tax. Surely a responsibility for the government to decide, not for a Royal Commissioner to propose. And its initial report also included various funding proposals that seemed to be closely linked to some of the key interests. And its second report was a tiresome, meandering consultant's document that was then implemented with even more political appointments, and also with many well-meaning but poorly directed people who ended up collapsing, I think, under the weight of the grand rhetorical principles, the excessive documentation and the reform visions of the Royal Commission. And they simply forgot some simple practical priorities of getting things done. It became, mental health reform in Victoria, that is, became a feeding trough for many client groups. Its implementation was delayed and confused. It became guided by impatient managerial utopians, not by the simple virtues of humility, kindness, compassion, and persistence. There were many loyal servants too who tried to do the right thing, but found it almost impossible to admit the impracticality and the flaws of the Royal Commission's proposals. And then came, of course, the pandemic and the shock, I guess, to the effectiveness of any government in those circumstances, but also the particular shock to the mental health of the community in Victoria, of the extreme zero COVID policies adopted by the Victorian government, and the negligence of mental issues in the assessments of the Victorian government health officials. Without going into specific details, they are the reasons I judge the Victorian Mental Health Royal Commission a failure. It failed people with mental illness, their carers and families, and the citizens. It became a spectacle for politics, not real change in the experiences, institutions and types of care for people with mental illness. It became another example of government failure in mental health and democracy. If you'd like to contribute to the Burning Archive or have me talk about a particular topic of interest to you, there are two great ways you can do it. One, you can join up to my free weekly newsletter at jeffrich.substack.com. And secondly, you can participate in my special reader competition that's running until the 30th of June 2023. All you need to do is tell me, what is your favourite episode of the Burning Archive podcast, and what is a fragment of the Burning Archive, a cultural or historical artefact meaningful to you that you'd like featured. You can tell me that on my Substack, on my YouTube channel, or leave me a message or a tweet. And what I'll do is I will make a podcast on the 3 best topics and make a YouTube video on the 3 preferred back episodes of the podcast. Okay, back to the show. What is the lesson of all this? And is there any consoling or inspiring wisdom from the Burning Archive, the fragments of the cultural heritage of the world that can help us go forward in response to the constant failures of governments in relationship to mental health, and indeed to other issues of concern in what we still fondly call democracies? Well, I think it's a popular argument to say in the mental health world that mental health is kind of uniquely badly treated in the health system and in government policy, that we need to have parity of esteem between mental health and physical health, that mental health is a kind of Cinderella, the unloved stepchild of government policy. And I don't really accept that this is the cause of the failure. I don't really think mental health is the Cinderella of government policy. In fact, it has enjoyed great privileges in recent times because it is an issue of concern to so many people. It becomes symbolically important for governments to be seen, to be trying to do something about mental health, and this has led some key advisors to have very special relationships with government leaders. But I don't think those relationships ultimately have led to enough positive change for people with mental health. Another issue is maybe there's an incompatibility of thinking between dealing with mental health and the kind of reformers that you get in the top of managerial organisations, in top of political organisations. And I do think in part some of the difficulty for the causes of the failures of governments in mental health is the difficulty of marrying the manipulative political managerial mind, the sort of creators of vision dominated by left hemisphere thinking, if we can use Ian McGilchrist's terms from The Master and the Emissary. There's a difficulty of marrying that kind of left hemisphere sort of thinking with the chaotic experience, the messy experience of mental illness, caring for people with mental illness, enduring the ups and downs of both mental illness itself as well as the services provided to people with mental illness. I think the primary reason why governments fail in mental health is because they fail in mental health just as they do in other realms of policy, in other realms of their responsibilities. Mental illness is not a tragic exception to policy reform, but an interesting variation of widespread democratic government failure. Governments, especially democratic governments, endlessly have to reinvent their brands and their visions of progress and their new groundbreaking policies, their firsts, their big initiatives, their big announceables that they can sell into a consumer market. And in that context, governments, especially democratic governments, have difficulty putting reasonable boundaries around their aims and their practical concerns for others, especially when those aims impinge on such a fundamental human experience as mental illness or madness. Governments tend to build systems in the sky and do not pay enough attention to the troubled person who stands before them. And this is a fairly philosophical view around it, but perhaps appropriate for a podcast such as this. But there is, I think, hope. And here we have a fragment of The Burning Archive, which is, I guess, an attitude towards politics that is different to that of the impatient, bureaucratic, managerial reformers. Vaclav Havel, the great Czech playwright who I've talked about previously on the podcast, in I think it was his essay Politics and Conscience, said that I favour politics as one of the ways of seeking and achieving meaningful lives, of protecting them and serving them. I favour politics as practical morality, as service to the truth, as essentially human and humanly measured care for our fellow humans. It is, I presume, an approach which in this world is extremely impractical and difficult to apply in daily life. Still, I know no better alternative. And perhaps it's that attitude that governments need to bring to mental health reform. But to do so, they have to abandon what the English political philosopher Roger Scruton described as unscrupulous optimism, and bring instead a kind of what he also described as a scrupulous pessimism. In the uses of pessimism, he wrote that the most important criticism of utopian thinking, even the kind of utopian thinking that you get in royal commissions and bureaucratic agencies, the most important criticism to be made of this way of thinking is not that it is contradictory, though it is, but that by pursuing a single and complete solution to a human conflict, a solution that eliminates the problem forever, it destroys the institutions that enable us to resolve our conflicts one by one. Effective democratic process needs to sit in a culture of tolerance for imperfection and not managerial plans for utopia. Mental illness, the imperfection and madness of our minds, all of our minds, is the ultimate reminder of social imperfection, the ultimate reminder that plans of zero COVID or zero harm or zero suicide or zero road deaths or any kind of year zero are ultimately failures. What we've witnessed, I think, especially over the last 30 years, is a forgetting of this culture of tolerance for imperfection, and instead a growing use of politics as a spectacle of progress in some virtual reality of levelling up, a term used by the British government, and zero harm, a term used by the Victorian government, of elimination of whatever the policy enemy is, of dissolving all difficulties by simply changing the word we use to point to it. To me, that attitude is fundamentally why governments keep failing people with mental illness. Our political culture has grown uncomfortable with imperfection and too fond of virtual reality spectacles. We need to abandon the spectacle and instead offer, as Vaclav Havel said, to offer humanly measured care for our fellow humans. And how we do that in our imperfect democracies, in our imperfect societies, in our imperfect cultures is, I guess, one of the great ethical challenges for our time, isn't it? But and it's an issue that I will continue to talk about on the podcast. Perhaps also the idea of a second culture, a culture not officially mandated through government, is a great refuge. But in the meantime, I think this podcast offers a way to talk through that difficulty and to grow comfortable with all the imperfections and all the shades of grey of the world crisis of our time, a world crisis that is as much about mental illness as it is about geopolitics, that is as much about derangement as it is about diplomacy, that is as much about madness as it is about military positioning. And that's what I will keep doing, and hopefully I will continue to find, as I have with Roger Scruton and Vaclav Havel, and to some degree also the Norwegian political sociologist Steinringen found, fragments of the burning archive that can keep on going on by calling that going and calling that on. Thanks for listening to this podcast. I hope you appreciate some of my personal accounts of, I guess, what I learned in 33 years of being a very, very minor government official, and a few other personal life experiences and wide reading about the history of mental illness and whether or not governments have done a good job on it. Of course, people are more than welcome to offer their alternative views. If you like, you can send me a message or comment. One great way to do that is to join my free weekly newsletter at jeffrich.substack.com. And every Saturday I send out an email with glimpses of the multipolar world, covering all sorts of weird and wonderful connections between my perceptions of history, culture and geopolitics. And do share this podcast with others. Let me know what you think. And until next time, do remember, as Ezra Pound said in Canto 81, what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.